Chapter 1. Chapter 1. Here we begin. Let's for a moment sit ourselves down in a chimerical, compact music hall in a recreated Boston. First of all, I used the word chimerical, which I always thought was chimerical, but I actually just looked it up and it's chimerical. Because it was a it was a word that one of my first plays, Road in the River, one of the main characters or the actors, Tim, was in an interview, not in an interview, in a review of the play, was called chimerical, and I actually remember having to look it up at the time, and it basically means, or it says here, existing only as a product of unchecked imagination. So unchecked imagination, or fantastical. So that's why I use that word. And I recreated Boston. So connected but not affiliated with the more prestigious and less illusory venue called the Middle Eastern Cafe. That is a real place, and it is still there. Let's imagine that you are a 33 or thereabout year old well-mannered male who is a relatively well-respected and well-liked guitarist in a quasi-renowned band called Semi-Famous. The book sort of explores the idea of being semi-famous, so I thought it would be an interesting path to chart a band that was actually called Semi-Famous. And there are some jokes that lead up to that throughout the whole book. Semi-Famous has helped to create a popular subcultural neo-pop punk genre that you happen to be submerged in as we speak. Let's also pretend you are not at this time performing live with Semi-Famous. Let's pretend that you are temporarily playing second guitar for a wet behind-the-air cordial trio of young adult Western punks in a band called the Boys from Wyoming. I used to actually call the Lillingtons the Boys from Wyoming all the time. So that's sort of why I came up with that name for them. And I wanted it to be sort of obvious for the punks who actually knew the Lillingtons, the who I was talking about. So it's probably not much of a surprise for you guys to realize that the Boys from Wyoming were actually based on the Lillingtons. This band owes a good portion of their musical influence to Semi-Famous. The musical characteristics of Semi-Famous were based on an old style made new and prevalent, energetic, rebellious, simplistic, yet layered with intricate melodies and harmonies. It had a rough edge and a vulgar tongue. Ben Weasel being the vulgar tongue. It made these young lads in a small imaginary town want to start their own punk rock band. And that's also true of the non-imaginary town that the boys were from in Wyoming. It made these young lads in a small imaginary town want to start their own punk rock band. It was more than music. It was a symbol of how they felt. It was anger and praise of the sun. I say that praise of the sun part because I feel a lot of Ben's songs, and I also had this sort of this inclination too, that we often wrote songs about sun or about light or covered songs like I Can See Clearly. I think it goes probably plays back to the idea of anxiety and rebelliousness and not fitting in that idea of looking for that ray of light or that ray of hope. And I think a lot of the chord progressions actually play with that feeling too. I find it in a lot of music. There's this chord progression there where it goes from the lower to the higher, and it sort of has that feeling of brightness. So as I go on, it was unbridled and rebellious intelligence. It was messy as hell and at times completely, utterly stupid. I remember talking to my friend Spike in my improv group Sheila, and I told him that our lyrics were actually, the Ramones were an influence, one of the influences, and, like Circle Jerks and a lot of other bands. But I felt Ben's lyrics were actually more intellectual. And then he shot back at me, oh, yeah, fart in a puddle. That's really intellectual. So, sometimes Screeching Weasel could be utterly stupid. And sadly, that's what a lot of bands hold on to instead of the more intellectual part of the band. Okay, new paragraph. Having been raised in a small town in Wyoming, the boys had found it hard to get their hands on the independently released Semi-Famous recordings. Availability has changed slightly over time in accordance with the increase and decrease of your band's semi-fame. But in the early imaginary days of semi-famous, local small-town record stores could only take a minimal amount of risk on independently released music. The majority of independent bands can be easily described with one overgeneralized statement. They are a large, diverse group of unaffiliated bands that are not distributed by major labels. DIY equals dumb, idiotic yahoos. Although this gets more and more complicated as the days go by because the plundering major labels and their not so mysteriously cloaked corporate backers have begun to purchase hordes of independently run labels, thereby leaving many musicians, critics, and underground music collectors in a bemused and erratically unenlightened quandary. It's kind of funny because I think since then now this whole quandary is happening again because labels are almost not as much needed because of the internet and how music is working. So it's revolutionizing everything basically. It's just like what the I'm wearing glasses now because I'm an old man. I can't remember things. But it's what the industrial age, is a big change for society, and I think the sort of the internet or computer age has the same effect, and we're all still trying to figure that out. These cultural degenerates spend much of their energy debating whether or not these labels can still be considered independent. This issue has become deadening and in many cases irrelevant in the face of modern musical trends. I remember in the record stores, there was a couple sections. We used to go to Record City in Wheeling on Dundee, and there was sections that were called imports, and they also had independent. They didn't. Alternative wasn't really a word then. I never really liked that word alternative in terms of music. Because once it became popular, it wasn't the alternative anymore. So what is the point of calling something alternative if it's the mainstream music? But we used to always look in the import sections and the independent sections of the record stores for the records that we wanted. I used to buy stuff just based on the cover. Same thing with comic books. Other independent bands may be described as musicians who want the high level of success only achieved on major labels, but can't figure out how to move into a position of being coddled by a major label without getting ripped off or severely ignored in the process. There are also those bands that are even farther out of touch with reality of this unrealistic world of independent music. These bands lack common sense or the drive to have their music heard. This view of creativity in music can be respected or twisted into a misrepresented in music can be respected or twisted into a misrepresented respect if the intention is nonchalance toward my God, what kind of, I just tried to pull out all the words in this section. And like in playwriting, I got much better at playwriting over time, but I was able to hear the actors say the words out loud, so I kind of in a moment would go, ooh, that's a little bit too wordy for what I'm trying to say. But when you're writing a novel, you don't have a lot of that influence until your editor comes in, and your editor only works as hard as you want them to. So let me try that sentence again. This view of creativity in music can be respected or twisted into a misrepresented respect if the intention is nonchalance toward obscurity. Music can be respected or twisted into a misrepresented respect of the intention is nonchalance to obscurity. Yeah. Yeah, so basically I'm saying if ignorance can sometimes look like it's a choice, like, oh, we're too good to be on a major label, but really we just don't know how to do it. So with all those words, that's what I was trying to say. But a large percentage of musicians just don't have a clue when it comes to marketing their own band to get themselves to the point where the world respects their vain, indulgent megalomania. Their music is going to be hard to find no matter how diligent a possible fan may search. That is, of course, if they are even worth listening to, which is a whole other unrealistic world deserving of commentary and ridicule. Semi-famous is the type of band that wanted and enjoyed, for the most part, full control of every aspect of their creativity and the unavoidable business associated with independence. This, of course, meant no distribution by major labels. For most of the band's career, the major labels, the few that knew of their existence, felt a similar disregard. Who needed them? Really, who needed us? Who needed them? Punk fans, similar to the boys from Wyoming, who lived in small towns throughout the whole globe, had to go out of their way to find semi-famous records, tapes, and compact discs. They had to order them through mail-order catalogs and wait patiently for their packages to arrive. You know, I'm going off on a lot of this, and I'm going to suffer through because this is the idea. But a lot of this was I was trying to set up, this is all like, what do you call that, premise? Like I was just trying to set up that things were different back then. It was harder to tour because we didn't have cell phones and the internet and all that stuff. So I was just trying to set up how easy it's become to listen to music these days. Sometimes they had to wait for weeks and weeks. Sometimes they had to wait for months. Occasionally their packages would never arrive. Who knows why? But they waited with anticipation. It helped to make the music special, highly individual. It made the excitable, deviant portion of the rest imaginary world seem a little closer. You know, I go on about this, and I truly believe this. I mean, that's because, but I wasn't really much of a record mail orderer. This is based more on me writing about Ben's experiences, and Ben used to order records all the time through the mail. I had my connections at Record City, so I used to go there and get a lot of good independent records. But he, of course, was able to get stuff that they couldn't actually get into record stores. The boys from Wyoming are proud of this influence in such an emphatic way that they often appear stringent and antisocial, highly critical of music that veers from the forceful melodic sound they love so vehemently. That's always been true of the Lillingtons, and just now, after so many years, Cody's allowing a little bit more and different influences to come into the band. If he's going to do it this many years later, I respect that, and he's figuring out his new way, and I think it's very exciting. You may expect them to treat you special because of your affiliation, but for some reason they peer through their tunneled admiration and treat you like you are just good friends. Let's imagine that this is exactly how you want to be treated. It's true. That's I say to you, the audience. Now, this isn't in the book. I sound like I'm talking from the book, but that's always been my thing. It's always been very important to me to try to break through that acknowledging of being like a semi-famous person and try to just relate to people, personally one-to-one. And how I would do that often a lot by, once they would ask about the band, I would answer questions, but I would ask questions back, like about their own lives. And, it's hard to, I still have friends that I know in the back of their heads, they're like, I can't believe I'm hanging out with Jughead, but I hope for the most part that goes away, and then they just sort of see us, or see me, us as an I and me, and the you as just John Pearson. Here it comes. I glare at you and say, why? Let's not forget that I am there too, sitting close by the same table in this adjacent but not affiliated club. I am staring right into those fatigued eyes that are adjacent but not affiliated with the rest of your mute face. I'm not really a very unkind person in general, I think. Sometimes my humor can be sadistic and mean, but I created this I character, so the book is in first person and second person. I created this I character to be a little bit more of a critical person about myself. Like, I think it allowed me to pop out of myself and be a little bit more angry at me, to sort of, I don't know, flush out what I was really going through during these days. And then in quotes, why should they be your friends? I stare at you a little longer, puzzled, because it seems as if you have gone away. It seems as if you are somewhere else, a location removed from this overcrowded bar where persons breathe in secondhand smoke and perspiration and are constantly in the way of a steadfast stream of young, sprightly skate kids and drunken leather-faced punks of shit yore heading toward the merchandise counter. quickly constructed out of an old piece of paneling, 2 rickety bar stools, and a load of duct tape, and stumbling away from the fully stocked bar. You are elsewhere, perhaps living out a complete, alternate life, all within the span of a handful of seconds. I just want to stop here to say that this You Are Elsewhere is based on, I don't know if that's a direct quote of the title, but I'm very influenced by Milan Kundera as a writer. I think he has a book that's called You Are Elsewhere or something similar to that. I'll try to get that in the after corrections. So there, I continue. An animated, fresh identity that springs from the question, why, and disappears before you can gather enough thoughts to respond. I'm sort of giving the impression that this whole story happens in like the blink of an eye, like this whole book is just a moment of thought. You stare up and over my head, looking towards the makeshift merch table. You see the singer from the Boys from Wyoming stationed behind the bands, slowly but steadily selling merchandise. Cody Templeman. He has a wad of bills in his right hand and an assortment of black and white T-shirts tucked under both arms. He glances in your direction and catches you examining his stiff and bashful salesman pose. He cracks a smile that takes a long but pleasant time to trench its way up and across the sides of his face. You smile back, nod your head, and perhaps even snicker for a moment, having remembered a similar smile of his from last night, during a midnight drive from state to state, when it was harder to smile because all were tired and in need of sleep. A potential young customer approaches the table. The kid pulls out a wallet from his threadbare back pocket. A chain stretches from the corner of the wallet to a belt loop on his hip. He raises the open wallet above the merch table and comes only millimeters away from a self-imposed wedgie. I think I've always had this fascination with those wallets with the chains on them, because in a play later about Even in Blackouts that I wrote for a group in Atlanta, Georgia, I wrote about a wallet getting stuck on a counter. I think there was something about those punk chain and wallets that just kind of, in my mind, always led to some sort of comical happening. The singer from the Boys from Wyoming's attention shifts quickly to the endangered customer. You lower your head, and there I am, still staring at you. How do you have time to even think about these things now? I say to you, somewhat accusatory in tone. Aren't you distracted by all the people staring at you, recognizing you? Aren't you distracted by your own need for this strangely alienating recognition? And you wonder if I am right. You wonder whether you are at this club or not. Perhaps this has already happened. Perhaps when you were actually there amidst the smoke and loud live sound, there was no reason to contemplate the friendship that at the time seemed natural. Perhaps something happened much later that put this strange friendship in question, which makes you see the past in a way that seems foreign, a novel new way that is sadly somber. This is me just trying to be smart and sort of like from the Neo-Futurist, my group where we write material about ourselves. One of the techniques is very meta, and I love meta theater and meta fiction, where you sort of pop out and end up talking about the process of writing, or the process of being the person who is doing the writing. And this is basically all about that. It's about, and that's what the first person and second person does, but like I was talking about, tries to pop the reader out of the story, almost like Brecht does for theater. But you are there. Now try to look up at the singer from the Boys from Wyoming. Is he busy selling merchandise? Is he staring back at you? Where's the rest of the band? Is the bass player from the Boys from Wyoming sitting next to you? That's Corey. He has been there the whole time. No, he is not there. He just left to go back pack up the equipment. But it feels like he has been gone for a long time. Maybe he went to go get something to eat. But the two of you ate not too long ago at a corner deli up at the end of the street, which is gone now. Now it's some sort of uppity coffee shop. Neither of you wanted the predictable fast food yet again. McDonald's and Burger King are two of the handful of familiar fast food restaurants these boys obsessively eat at when there is no one else around to object. It makes It makes them feel at home. It gives them a sense of security, of regularity. The singer from the Boys from Wyoming enjoys the same tasting substances meal after meal. You impart your worldly influence on them by occasionally suggesting additional places to dine. On this tour, You have made a good share of disgusting mistakes, but each mistake is still an adventure, no matter how inedible the food ends up tasting. You know, this isn't actually very true about me. As I'm reading this, I realize some of this is about what I kind of wanted to be. I've always wanted to be more of a exploring guy that goes into places that you've never been to before. And that's kind of why I cling to pretty extreme personalities often, because I'm just too afraid to do things like I'm talking about in this paragraph right here. Today, the bass player from the Boys from Wyoming takes a chance and joins you for a sandwich at the corner deli, committed partly to a low-carb diet introduced to you by a friend back home. You bypass the french fries and sub-sandwich and just order a basket of onion rings and a large Diet Coke. The immense overflowing portion of battered whole onions is laughable. It could feed the entire crowd back at the venue. That was actually true. After a few of these battered onions, you look out a window over the bass player from the Boys from Wyoming's shoulder. A middle-aged man with long, straggly black hair passes by outside. A necessary patched beard, used more as a napkin than a statement, grows on his cheeks, neck, and chin. There is a felt Robin Hood cap with feather intact upon his head. It is held in place on the tip of his skull by clumps of nurtured, unwashed, naturally adhesive hair follicles. He is wearing a long gray wool raincoat with a belt that drags behind and dips into the puddles. As he walks by the window, he looks into the restaurant and sees you sitting there, staring back. He stops. He looks familiar. It could be the guy who promoted shows in Worcester so many years ago. They both have an uncanny resemblance to Charles Manson. That's a real guy. I mean, Charles Manson is, but the guy that I'm talking about from Worcester. The promoter looked like Manson minus Charlie's crazed beady eyes and stylish swastika tattoo embedded in his forehead. The eyes of the Mr. Promoter guy from Worcester were soft and kind, albeit bloodshot. Plus, there was no swastika above his eyes. There was only a pair of woolly, lackadaisical eyebrows, half-heartedly watching over the rest of his face. He had a perpetual grin that added greatly to his likeness to Manson. He even had a following of young female underage fledglings like Chuck. I was actually good friends with one of the girls I'm referring to here. She was a writer, and I remember meeting her a few years later. She moved to a smaller town and sort of rented her own little room. I just admire this sort of idea of especially women being able to go off and by themselves to somewhere that they don't know. And she basically just bought a little room, or rented a room, and decided she was going to write a novel there. I lost contact with her because we didn't have Facebook and stuff back then, so I don't know whether she ever finished, but I really admired her for doing that. The fledgling smoked pounds of hash off the tip of a rusty nail protruding from a broken 2x4. They giggled incessantly at his harmless jabs and private jokes. During a moment of mutual gawking, it becomes obvious that this pitiful figure is merely staring at the food. He does not know you at all. It could still be that promoter guy who lived in Worcester so many years ago. Very few words were spoken to that promoter. Even though you booked the majority of the tours, most of the conversations about scenes and local punk politics were left to the singer from Semi-Famous. You just like to watch the people move about their business. Nothing to say to them, really. It would not be a surprise if he no longer knew you, so there's no reason to say hello, even if it is him. Yet you still wonder whether or not it is that Manson-like Robin Hood punk rock promoter who lived in Worcester so many years and years ago. The bass player from the Boys from Wyoming reaches into your basket of onion rings. What are you looking at? I thought I recognized that fellow, but I'm not sure. He was from Worcester. It's not really that far away. It could be him. The moment you begin talking to the bass player from Boys from Wyoming, the could-be promoter look-alike begins to walk out of sight. The bass player from the Boys from Wyoming takes a quick look over his own shoulder and then looks back. It is hard to tell whether or not he spots the man before the figure disappears from sight. He takes another onion ring from the basket. This is all made up, of course. There was no homeless guy or at least magical homeless guy outside the window. But it was a good device, as you'll see for the rest of the book. And he says, "Worcester, huh? Semi-Famous played in Worcester?" "Yes." "Why the hell did you guys play in Worcester?" It's kind of funny. Whenever I said I played somewhere with Corey, whenever I said to Corey we played somewhere, he would always say something like, "Why the hell would you play in Muskegon?" Or "Why the hell would you play?" You know, he just never really enjoyed playing, but he loves the music that the Lillingtons write, and he writes with. Our first show in Massachusetts, my God, that was more than 13 years ago. And then he says, I was only 9. Pause. Anyway, the show wasn't even in Boston. We couldn't get booked here. We traveled nonstop all the way from Chicago to Worcester, only to eventually play in front of 5 people, including the sound man, the promoter, and 2 of his fledglings. Fledglings? Yes, fledglings. Followers. Tag-alongs. Jailbait. Oh, so really you only had 1 person to show up? Yeah, I guess so. There might have been only 4. Maybe no one showed up, but I do recall at least 1 solitary person standing in the middle of the empty room. It was a huge church, and the emptiness of the venue caused the music to reverberate off the walls like we were sinking into a bottomless mosh pit. That's true. I don't really recall if it was actually just 1 person, but I know from on stage in that big empty room, it felt like 1 person. He grins and snickers a bit. The only spectacular thing that came out of my experience with that town was the Sherlock Holmes hat I bought at a thrift store earlier in the day. The lack of sleep skewed my fashion sense. He shakes his head in agreement as he surveys your clownish attire. It didn't fit my head quite right, but even so, I thought it looked cool. It had 2 flaps and a bow that tied at the top. Not very functional. Would you like another onion ring? Sure. There's no tax on clothes in Massachusetts. I didn't know that until I bought that hat. Did you have any clue? No, I didn't. Oh, speaking of hats, I once walked into a thrift shop in San Francisco with Muddle and Mr. Famous. We must have been chatting with an accent unfamiliar to the woman behind the counter because she asked us where we were from, and I said, a faraway third world country known as Chicago, and she said, oh, Chicago, as if she had just met alien beings from a disgusting little planet in the smuttiest galaxy. You people are racist there, aren't you? And then I paused for a few dramatic, pensive moments, then gave her the minimal amount of satisfaction she was after. Yes, we most definitely are. None of us happened to mention to her that we hardly saw any African Americans anywhere near her store's location, and that the division of races in segregated areas was just as shocking there in San Francisco than back in the Midwest. But it got me thinking about perceptions we formulate without first-hand experience or sufficient knowledge. Oh? It's obvious what I'm playing with here is that I just love telling stories, and I'm just trying to give the impression that Corey could probably care less. I never know. I think why I used to like telling him stories is because I couldn't tell whether he was enjoying it or not. Tell me something. What? The things I say to you are interesting, or at least mildly entertaining, aren't they? Sure. I don't come across as a pedant, do I? I don't know. What does pedant mean? Exactly! That's a very good answer. Even if you did phrase it as a question, there's always so much more to learn and experience. How could I be pedantic? Thank you. The bass player from the Boys from Wyoming takes a bite of his steak and cheese sandwich. You tell him they are supposed to taste best in Philadelphia. Well, this one goes down just fine. And then, as if it were the same thought, he says, I hate this town. This makes you smile. The emotion packed into this agreeable facial gesture is part of a phenomenon that allows you to exist in numerous moments at once. The sentimental gesture links you to the singer from the Boys from Wyoming, who cracks a smile while holding wads of money in his hand. It binds you to Muddle, that's Vapid, that's his real name, Vapid, the bass player in your own band, the one who was fired, asked back, and then later was permitted to quit without much outward resistance from the shell-shocked remaining members. And this went on to happen again as people are familiar with the band. He became even more known for joining the band and quitting again. He is the one who never, ever genuinely goes away. He is in the front passenger seat of the Chevy Malibu, 12 days into a 7-week tour, 10 years in the past. He turns back to you with a tired, flaccid smile, clutching loosely to the muscles around his jaw. It's beginning to feel a lot like tour. It is a joke that the two of you share. And because you know what he is going to say in advance, your smile precedes his turn. You hear his words before he even thinks to say them. When that particular tour started, 3 of the 4 band members, including you and Muddle, packed up the Chevy a few minutes before midnight, or a half hour in front of noon, with guitars, drums, sleeping bags, pillows, comforters, books, ledgers, and a metal box full of nothing but paper and pens. There was a large, hard plastic crate full of homemade silk-screened ink-splotched T-shirts roped and tightly fastened to the roof of the car. The Chevy and the crammed 3 of the foursome, including you and, of course, Muddle, traveled a short distance to pick up the drummer for the 4th of the compressed, tightly packed foursome. From in front of his house or from the parking lot behind his high school, with the foursome complete, the Malibu took to the road with $400 in cash stuffed in a white envelope. There's a new Providian Visa credit card in your front pocket and a full tank of low-grade unleaded fuel in the old rusted Chevy gas tank. Of course, this is then I pop back in time, and this I'm talking about now is the incarnation of Screeching Weasel that was Brian Verman on drums, Vapid, I think he was playing bass then, me on guitar, and then Ben also on guitar and vocals. Sitting shotgun somewhere within the first minutes of the tour, you turn around to face the back seat and say with an exaggerated amount of gusto, "Does it feel like tour yet?" Muddle does not understand what you mean, but he laughs a little anyway. "We haven't left yet." "I know." Then you repeat the question with an identical amount of exaggerated gusto. "Does it feel like tour yet?" He stops forcing his confused and obviously superficial laughter. He then drops all expression from his face and thinks for a moment. After a brief flash passes through his brain, whispering paranoid slander about your possible insanity, he allows himself to truly interpret the joke's intent, the absurdity of its timing. His eyes open wide. His look is kindred to a deer caught in headlight, but not a frozen and frightened deer, a simple, curious fawn, bemused by the bright lights radiating from the dark and sublime object that is about to tear its fragile body to pieces. No, come to think of it, it doesn't feel like tour yet. He smiles, then he sinks the side of his face into his filthy little blanket, shuts his cute furry eyelids, and falls deep asleep. Quicker than immediately. Quicker than immediately. I like that phrase. His arms grip the sides of his pillow and his knees press up against the donated caseless base. He reaches an arm around the pillow toward his face as if to suck his thumb, but the hand changes course and heads for a nostril. He picks at his nose and farts in his sleep. He's a little child. No, he's not. You turn back around, and there I am, sitting next to you, squeezed between the singer of the band and yourself. There's hardly room for 4 in this car, and here I am, forcing my way in, making it 5. It would probably be better if I weren't here at all. He's not a child. You are definitely not his parent, and neither is this guy. I angle my head to the left, pointing toward the driver. I point with my finger, but there isn't enough room to raise my arm. But he'll find out that soon enough. What do you mean? You stare at the driver for a moment. Smoke issues from his mouth. His forearm is rested on the open window's edge. He looks at you, raises and lowers his bushy eyebrows a few times, with the ease of a skilled mime in complete control of every gesture. Then he tops it with a sly sneer, impersonating a smile. "What did you say? Did I say something?" "You should know." "How long have you been driving?" "About 5 hours." "That's strange. It feels like we just started. Do you need me to drive?" "Not yet." "That's Franklin Famous, Ben Foster. Ben Weasel." "He's the singer, songwriter, spokesperson of the band. He is your friend. He will be there a long time beside you. Even later on, when the two of you fall into a pattern of not seeing each other for months on end, taking friendship for granted with barely anything in common, you will still be beside each other. During the last few years of the band, you will live miles apart, on opposite sides of a large city, only talking on phones, exchanging emails about business-related topics, and FedExing one another CDs and pages of contracts and agreements. Just let me know when you're tired. You passed the mandatory 4-hour shift more than an hour ago." That actually was a shift that Ben had set up that everyone would get 4 hours, but Vermin didn't know how to drive, so it was really only me and Ben that did most of the driving. But I think I talk about that later. "I'm fine," he says. How quickly we lose track of time. You look out the passenger window of the Chevy Malibu and begin to count the white-tipped wooden stake mile markers as they pass by and fade away. "You don't hate this town." "No, but I'd rather be somewhere else." "Back home in Wyoming, digging holes?" "No." You offer him another onion ring. As you see what I did there, and why I think it's maybe confusing to people at first is, without any explanation, I went from talking to Ben in the car to being back in the restaurant with with Corey. But I was hoping that line by the end, you offer him another onion ring, of course, obviously brings you back to the restaurant. So that's the end of chapter 1.
All right, so I only have two corrections I'd like to make. First, I had said premise when I actually meant exposition, which exposition is basically backstory so that your audience knows what's going on. And the second one was the name of the Milan Kundera book is called Life is Elsewhere. I've read it a couple times, and it always seems to affect my brain in all the things that I'm writing at the time. Milan Kundera actually is a lot of his writing is very metafictional, which means it's about writing. He creates great stories, but his stories are also about the writing of the stories. So that's it. Thank you for listening once again. Please put some comments down there if you are liking what's going on, or if you have some questions that I can answer. Thank you. Second addendum, for some reason my photo booth video thing goes back and forth between reverse image and correct image. So this is the correct image, but that whole episode was the book looked backwards. I'm going to try to figure that out for the rest of them, but at least the voice isn't backwards.